With us for worship in our new tabernacle or to our drive-in services on the property. Service times are 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. on Sunday and 7 p.m. on Wednesday. You can find further information about our church on our church website at calvarybaptistnews.com. Please join us for our service today as we look into God's holy word of truth.
I mean, it's not a great city as far as, it's desert, but God chose to place his name there. But they're celebrating in Jerusalem's downfall. And so God says, you know what? I'm against you. And I'm going to pronounce a judgment against you. Here's what's going to happen, verse 3. And I will cause many nations to come up against thee, and the sea as the sea causeth his waves to come up, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyrus and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. He says, not what's like Jerusalem, right? Not one stone would be left upon another. Here's what's going to happen. In your whole city, not just the temple, but in your whole city, not one stone will be left upon another. Not only that, he says, I'm going to take your stones and I'm going to throw into the sea. I'm going to take your timbers, I'm going to throw them into the sea. I'm going to scrape up your dust and throw it into the sea. So when you go there, there's never been a city here. Look over, if you would, please, at verse number 5. It shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. Now I want you to know the details. This city is going to be taken and thrown into the sea. And it's going to be a place where people are going to be standing on the sea and they're going to be spreading their nets upon it. In the midst of the sea, that's where it's going to be. For I have spoken, saith the Lord, and it shall become a spoil to the nations. Look at verse 12. They shall make a spoil of thy riches, they shall make a prey of thy merchandise, and they shall break down thy walls, and destroy thy pleasant houses, and they shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the water. Look at verse 14. And I will make thee like the top of a rock. Thou shalt be a place to spread nets upon. Thou shalt not be built no more. For I, the Lord, have spoken, saith the Lord God. Now that's a very strange prophecy. Because in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, when he had finished with Jerusalem, later on he came against Tyre and he laid siege to the city of Tyre. Now the city of Tyre was like this. This little red spot on the coast. Now this is a very simple drawing obviously, but here, this is where the city of Tyre was, the ancient city of Tyre. Now off the coast, about 1/2 mile, is a small island. You see the island? Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city. Now Nebuchadnezzar didn't have a navy. He's from Babylon, doesn't have a navy. But the Phoenicians did. The Phoenicians had the largest and the best navy in the world at that time. And so in the 13-year siege, and they didn't have enough. Who has enough food the last 13 years? Now they said Babylon did, but 13 years it took him to take this city. And all the way, in a clandestine way, people were moving their stuff out of the city. And because they had boats, they were coming across to the island. Nebuchadnezzar didn't have boats, he didn't have a navy. And that was a place of safety. But finally, after 13 years, they finally make a final onslaught on the city. They get in there, they kill whoever's there, and take other people into slavery. And what Nebuchadnezzar does is he breaks down the walls, he breaks down the towers, and wrecks the city. And so it's basically rubble. And for the next 255 years, that happened 572 BC. But for 255 years, this part of the prophecy was not fulfilled. Part of it was fulfilled in that the towers would be broken down, the walls would be broken down. But the interesting part of the prophecy, which everybody would probably scratch in their head and say, wait a minute, who's going to take the time? Now think about this. Who's going to take the time to... They didn't have JCBs in those days. They didn't have bulldozers. You'd have to lift every stone. You'd have to lift every timber. You'd have to brush into a pan and put it into a bin, the dust, and then take it all the way to well, who did that? Somebody did that. They'd have to take it all the way to the coast and throw it into the water. Would you do that? I mean, you might wreck the city because you're destroying it and you're defeating it, but why would you take all this? I mean, a whole city, millions and millions of tons of stuff and throw it into the sea? Who in the right mind would do that? Nobody would do that. I got to go back here because that's giving away the game. So, after that siege, most of the people over those 13 years were actually out here. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't get to them. And they sat there for another 255 years. Now comes Alexander. Alexander comes down the coast. He's on his way to Alexandria. That's why it's called Alexandria, just occurred to me. So Alexander's on his way to Alexandria. And he's going to Egypt. He's passing by Tyre. Now, basically, everybody's fallen down before him, and and he's saying, "Okay, we want tribute, we want taxes." And one of the things I learned was he just wanted. He didn't really want their money. He basically just wanted their submission. And part of his deal was that whatever people, he would go into their towns, and he said, "Now, I'm going to come into your temple, and I'm going to offer a sacrifice to your God." Now, they had a temple on this island by this point, and he said to them, he sent them messengers, ambassadors, and he says, "Now, we're going to leave you alone as long as I can come into your temple and offer a sacrifice to your gods." Which he thinks he's doing them a good favor, right? He's trying to win their allegiance and their submission. But these Phoenician people in Tyre, they weren't having it. You couldn't actually go into their temple unless you were a citizen of Tyre. You couldn't go in there. And so, and let me just say that the old city of Tyre is in rubbles, and now the new city of Tyre is kind of over here. And what they did, and this is the thing that set Alexander off, they took those ambassadors, they sat them up on top of the wall that went around that island, they put them up on top of the wall, and they slit their throats, and they threw them over the wall into the sea. And old Alexander went crazy. He said, "Right, we're not going anywhere till we sort this out." And now Alexander didn't really have much of a navy either. Now these guys still had a navy. So how are they going to get over there? How's Alexander going to get over there and kill them all? How's he going to do it? Well, see, Alexander was a smart guy. And he looked around him and he saw all this rubble everywhere. They've been lying there for over 255 years. 255 years. He says, right, and of course, he already had slaves from all these different nations that he's already conquered on his way down. So he gets them all into action. And what does he do? He's going to build a causeway. Now, when you go to Northern Ireland, those who are going to Northern Ireland in September, will take you to the Giant's Causeway, which is basically a causeway is a road that goes across the sea. And in Northern Ireland, there's supposed to be two giants, one in Scotland, one in Ireland. I'll tell you the story later. Anyway, they build this. It's called a dam here, but they're building this. It's basically about a half mile, 800 meters offshore. And this is relatively shallow here, but they basically take all the stones and they transfer it to the coast and they start building a road into the sea. And they put the timbers in there, that kind of holes as they put, and they even scrape the dust up to pack into the stone so that they actually make a smooth road. You know why? Because Alexander was one of the first guys that made these big, there's a name for it, I can't remember, but these big towers that were on wheels, and they would wheel these towers down and had soldiers in the towers be firing their bows and arrows over at the enemy. And so that's what that would have looked like, these towers. And so here comes the causeway. And they're coming out to the island. Now, they had the ships. These guys the bad guys had the ship. Well, I guess they're both bad guys, but the Phoenicians had the ships. And you see here, they actually burned these big tar balls, and they threw them over at the towers, and they tried to burn them down on the way over. And so I can't remember how long it took, but I think it was about 6 months to build this thing all the way out. And they got right over there, and they got further and further over, and before long, these drawbridges were falling down on this. And Alexander's men went in there and they killed everybody. They wrecked the place. And he made an example out of those peoples that would stand against Alexander. And so what happened then, and this is the point, the prophecy then was fulfilled. Because old Tyre on the mainland was no more. The rubble was gone. Even they swept the dust up to pack it into the causeway to roll those machines across. And so for years they had this road that was still there. They're not going to. You think they're going to take it out again? No, it was thrown into the sea. Now, what happens with the sea when you have an artificial barrier like this? Well, the tides will wash up sand. See here, the sand will gather in this little area between the island and the coast, and so this photograph was taken in 1934. 1934, here's the island, and here's the causeway. It's still there. There's even a road still on it. And all the sands that have gathered up over the last 2,000 years. Okay? And that causeway was there when Jesus was alive. It's amazing. And so, if you see it today, that's what it looks like. Okay? So here's the island. And so where's Tyre? Tyre would have been over here. Is there any trace of it? Nope. Where is it? Right there, in the midst of the sea. What do they do here? They spread nets. There's a place where the fishermen fish from. And they spread their nets. exactly like the Bible said it would happen 255 years later. Now, in those 255 years, people could have come along and said, by the way, even people today are saying, well, the Bible says that Tyre would be destroyed. And you know what they're saying? Tyre is this, the island city. That's not what he was talking about. And they just completely disregard the scriptures. But I mean, during those 255 years, people could have read Ezekiel and said, now, wait a minute. God prophesied judgment. Well, Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the city. But the people are still out on the island. Tyre still exists, you know. And the rubble is still, I mean, where's the prophecy being fulfilled that the city would be thrown into the sea? And they said, there you go, see the Bible. It's not really that accurate until Alexander comes. And God fulfills his word exactly the way he said. Now, you might be here this morning and you're not really sure if you believe the Bible or not. Most people who don't believe the Bible are people who either have a bias or they don't know what they're talking about and they haven't actually studied the evidence. When you look at the evidence, you've got to come away and say, you know what? There's something about this. And the more you study it, the more you'll be convinced that the Bible is actually true. Yeah. And so if you're a doubter or a skeptic, and there's nothing wrong with being a skeptic. Thomas was a skeptic. He wanted to have evidence. God wants you to have evidence. The evidence is actually there. But God expects you to go looking for it. He expects you to examine the evidence before you come to a verdict. And friend, what I can assure you this morning is that the evidence is there and the Bible is absolutely true in every aspect. Well, as we come back to Daniel chapter 8, we know in history that Alexander dies in Babylon at age 32. It says of Alexander that he sat down and he cried because there was no more worlds to conquer. And it all happened like the leopard, very swift. Now the leopard had 4 wings on its back. And here it says in verse 22, now that being broken, what being broken? The horn, which is the first king, which is Alexander. Now he's writing this 200 years before Alexander was born. Isn't that amazing? You say, how do you know that? Because that's why you have the first 6 chapters. His whole life is intertwined with the history of that time. Do you believe it? Jesus believed it. In Matthew 24, Jesus said, when you see the abomination, as it was written by Daniel the prophet, Jesus believed in Daniel. The Jews believe in Daniel. It's accurate. Okay, in verse 22, now that being broken, Alexander's dead, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand out of the nation, but not in his power. Nobody was like Alexander. And you know, Alexander didn't have sons. He was only just a young fella. When he died, he was 32 years old. And I'm not really sure how. I'm sure he had children. I'm not sure exactly. But there was no dynasty. You know, a lot like with Nebuchadnezzar, there was a whole dynasty. But with Greece, there wasn't a dynasty. So when he knew he was dying, we don't know how he died. Some people say it was malaria, thyroid, or somebody poisoned him. But just before he died, he had 4 generals, and that's his 4 generals right there: Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimus, and Cassander. He got those 4 generals of the Grecian army, and he made them to be the leaders over the Grecian Empire. And so it was divided into 4 kingdoms, but they weren't anywhere near what Alexander was in their power. And here it is prophesied 200 years before it happened. This is secular history. So here you have the goat now. The main horn was broke off, and so 4 horns stand up in the place of Alexander. And we see that with these visions, like the monster representing the revived Roman Empire. There's 10 horns, and then there's a little horn that comes out of between those 10. And that little horn is the Antichrist of Rome. That is the Antichrist. Now, here we have a little horn as well. Look down. The little horn, look at verse number 9. So in verse 8, I'm going back and forth between the actual vision and the interpretation of the vision. Verse 8 and 9 is the vision. Verse 23 and so on is the interpretation. Verse 8 says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, that's Alexander, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, toward the north, toward the east, toward the pleasant land. Pleasant land speaking about Israel. So the plot thickens. Now he's saying, okay, the first king, the notable horn gets broken. For him, 4 horns comes up. And then out of one of those 4 horns comes a little tiny horn. Okay, I know this looks kind of nasty, but so here's the goat. I don't know who put this together, but and there's a lot of interesting stuff on here. For example, where do you get the history for this? Okay, First and Second Maccabees, which is part of the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is not scripture, but it is historical. And so First and Second Maccabees would give you the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, who is this little horn. And Josephus was the historian. He's very, very well trusted. And this is some of the things he said about Antiochus Epiphanes, and during that period of time. He said, and indeed it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote years before they came to pass. No prophecy was ever more accurately fulfilled than this, Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. Okay, so you have these four horns. And the horn in question was the Seleucus. And Seleucus was basically the same area like Babylon. He was over in the east. And so it says that this little horn that comes out of Seleucus, he comes toward the south and toward the east. So he's in the east, and he's coming over toward the south. He comes toward, I don't think I have a map of this. There was a map. You can get this online. But he's coming over toward the west. He's coming toward Israel, and he's coming toward Egypt. And so Antiochus Epiphanes, that's this guy right here, becomes a king, a leader of that fourth branch of the Grecian Empire. And this guy is bad news. Antiochus is a bad, bad man. Again, this is during the time of the Hellenization of the world. They're making everything Grecian, with Grecian philosophy and architecture, the Greek language, all of that. Now, when they come to the Jewish people, Antiochus wants to push Grecianism or Hellenism on the Jews. And some of them actually capitulate. But what this guy does, and I don't have time to get into all of this, but you can study this out for yourself. In 171 BC, he kills 40,000 Jews over a three-day period of time. Because the Jews are not wearing it. He's trying to impose his culture on them and by the way, the Grecian gods. He goes into the temple in Jerusalem. This is the restored temple, not Solomon's, but this is after they come back from Babylon. The restored temple. They go into the temple, and he goes into the Holy of Holies, and he erects a Greek statue of the Greek god Zeus in the Holy of Holies. What do you think that's going to do to the Jewish people, the religious Jewish people? They're going to go crazy. Then he takes a sow, a pig, and sacrifices a pig on the altar in the temple. I mean, of course, in Muslim culture, you know what they think about pigs, and the same thing's true in Jewish culture. And for him to do such a thing, that is an abomination of desolation. And it's not the abomination of desolation, but it's a type of what's going to happen with the Antichrist. And we'll get into this later on, but the Antichrist is going to slaughter 2/3 of the Jewish population. He himself is going to come into the temple, and he's going to set himself up as God. And again, that's what Antiochus did. He named himself Epiphanes. I am God manifest. The Jews weren't wearing it, not one bit of it. And what it did was he pushed them so hard and so fast that he sparked what we call the Maccabean revolt. And Judas Maccabee and his sons led a revolt against the Grecian army, against Antiochus Epiphanes, and they were successful. And after they were finished, now, by the way, if you look down at verse 13, look at verse 13. There's several things. I've got to run out of time here. He says, I heard one of the saints speaking to another saint, and said unto that certain saint, which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days shall the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Okay, so very quickly, what he did was he stopped. Obviously, he's in there putting his statues of Zeus up there. He's sacrificing pigs on the altar. So what does that mean? It means that all of the Jewish religion stopped. The daily sacrifices were stopped. Now, that's a big deal. And it was for 2,300 days. It's just short of it's like 6.5 years, okay? Now, I'll just give you a warning. The Seventh-day Adventists and other people have taken these days and say, well, they're not days, they're years. And that's when they come in, well, they think that Jesus, they come up with these fantastic scales of when Jesus is supposed to come or was supposed to come. And it's all a nonsense. You know what these days are? They're days. This was the days that the sanctuary was defiled when Antiochus was in power. But the prophecy was, and if somebody had the book of Daniel in those days, which was 360 years after this was written, he could have looked at chapter 8 and figured it out, that Antiochus' time was short. Because maybe the Maccabean revolt did understand all of those things, and maybe that's what spurred them on. But some of the things that happened was he killed the Jewish people, verse 11. He stopped the daily sacrifice, verse 12. And so all these terrible things were taking place. Now, what happened was this, that because the Maccabees defeated Antiochus, drove him out, they were able to go into the temple and cleanse it. He tells you it would only happen after 2,300 days, about 6.5 years. That's the whole time it would be trodden underfoot, where the Gentiles would be domineering and where it would be defiled. And so after that was over, then the Jews came back in. What did they do? They cleansed the temple. You see, this is all prophetic. You know, when Jesus came in his ministry, the first thing that he did in John chapter 2, at the beginning of his ministry, when he came to Jerusalem, what he did? He cleansed the temple. Do you remember that? He threw out the money changers. He cleansed the temple. Do you know what he did at the end of his ministry, at the triumphal entry, riding on the donkey, going into Jerusalem? First thing he did, or the last thing after, at the end of his ministry, he cleansed the temple again. Do you know the first thing he's going to do when he comes back? He's going to cleanse the temple. Do you know why? He said there isn't a temple. There will be. In the tribulation period, there'll be a temple. And the true Antichrist is going to defile the temple. Do you know what the first thing Jesus does when he comes back at the Battle of Armageddon? When he comes home, he comes into that temple, he's going to cleanse it. See, this is all prophetic things. So what happened here was, when Antiochus was driven out, that they came into the temple and they cleansed it and they dedicated it. The word for dedicate in Hebrew is Hanukkah. And that happened on the 25th of Tishlu, or December. The 25th of December, they celebrate every year the feast of Hanukkah. Hanukkah means dedication. It's also mentioned in John chapter 10 when Jesus went to the temple at the dedication. It's the feast of dedication. So Jesus celebrated the feast of dedication. And one of the things, I'm getting off on another rabbit trail here, but what happened was when they dedicated that temple, they didn't have the holy oil. It took I think it was more than 1 week to provide the holy oil. It's kind of like holy water, had to go through a certain procedure. And so they only had enough oil to burn the menorah for 1 day. And they thought, we don't have enough to keep. We're going to light this and it's going to go out. And they said, you know what? We're going to light it anyway. They lit it with only 1 day's worth of oil. And so they lit it. And you know what happened? It burned and burned and burned and burned for 8 days. And on the 9th day, they had the new oil ready to go. And they believed supernaturally that God made it burn for the 8 days. And that's why at Hanukkah, on December 25th, the Jewish people have not a 7-branch candelabra, but an 8-branch candelabra. I didn't even know they had one. I was in Jerusalem, went into a Jewish bookshop, and I said, why does that have 8? Stupid Irish guy, right? Why does this have 8 branches instead of 7? Because the candelabra, the Jewish candelabra, the menorah has 7 branches. This one has 8. I says, why is that? He says, that's for Hanukkah, because it burned for 8 days. But that's where that comes from Antiochus Epiphanes, this bad guy who is a foreshadow of the final Antichrist. And now the reason this is important, because when you get into the next chapter, you're going to meet the real Antichrist in chapter 9. And also when we get into the book of the Revelation, you're going to learn all about him. That we're preaching Daniel right now, so that you're going to be ready when we get the Revelation before the end of the year. That's why we're doing it. So it's a very detailed and interesting study, and I know I can't do it justice this morning, but here's what we know. We know this, that God knows the end from the beginning. We know that God's prophets are true. Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, they are all absolutely accurate. You say, I can't see it, I can't imagine it. You're talking about, the tribulation and Jesus coming and the rapture and we all go to heaven without dying and all these wonderful things. Fantastic. I just can't imagine it. Yeah, there's lots of things in the Bible they couldn't imagine how anybody would be stupid enough to take the ruins of old Tyre and throw it into the sea. This massive big city, all this rubble and stones and timbers and dust, and they're going to throw it. Who would do that? Alexander. Why would he do it? To get to those guys on the island. They didn't know all that would happen. Whenever God says something, you can take it to the bank. You can believe it. Now, millions won't. Billions won't. But you're one of the very few privileged people in the world that come into a church like this where somebody is standing up with a Bible in his hand saying, "Thus saith the Lord, here's what the truth of God is." And I've showed you enough today to at least whet your appetite, if you don't believe it already, to try and look into it to say, well, is this really true or not? Because you'll find out that it actually is. And so we know that the prophets of God are true, and we know that God's prophecies will come true. And they will come true exactly as he gave them. What I'm saying is this, is the Antichrist is real. Is he alive today? We don't know. Who is he? We have no idea. In fact, the Bible says nobody will know until we're gone. But he will deceive many, and Christ will come. You see, the whole thing with the tribulation period, people don't see this. The whole thing is a contest. It's a contest. It's a fight between Satan's man and God's man. And God's man will win. Jesus will defeat the Antichrist. The question is, whose side are you on? Say, I'm not on anybody's side. Oh yeah, yes you are. You're on one side or the other. Jesus said this, "He that gathereth not with me is scattered abroad." You got to be on the right team. You got to be on God's team. You need to have Jesus. You need to be saying, "I'm for Jesus." And you must come to him, come to Christ and believe upon him and make him your trust. Align yourself with him. When we have our baptism, that's a public identification. I'm on Jesus' side. I'm on God's team. Whose team are you on? Have you been saved? Have you believed upon Christ?
Thank you, friends, for listening to our broadcast today. All of our broadcast sermons can be found online at calvarybaptistnews.com. And if you live in the McMinnville, Tennessee area, we would love to have you come visit with us at our new tabernacle at 610 Myers Lane, McMinnville, Tennessee. This is Pastor Tom Fittis, wishing you every blessing as you seek to serve the Lord.
Then someone cared enough to bring the truth to me. Someone cared, and now my soul is free. I know it wasn't easy to be bold enough to share, but I'm so glad someone cared.